Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. It all begins on the other side of the fog untouched by man. There was a place called Hesperides. It was a place where there were gardens with the fruits of the gods, guarded by fairies and even dragons. It was a land of monsters that people dared not even approach. It's that beautiful place where legends live. It was the home of the notorious wicked who could stroll along the coast drinking iced Americanos. The girl with green hair who was doing just that suddenly took off her glasses and looked around, unable to understand where everyone had gone. Then she walked closer to the shore and saw a sign for people to beware of the jellyfish, for her identity had finally been revealed. This girl was so thoroughly pissed off that she even tore down that little sign with one punch, calling everyone an idiot. She thought about the fact that no one was in this place anyway, even though she'd been gone so long, so she didn't think anyone might even be waiting for her. She decided to just accept it and go home quietly, for the sake of finally seeing what she hadn't seen for so long. In fact, this girl's name was actually Medusa. She had snakes for hair, and when you looked into her eyes, everyone turned to stone. Even she could do that. But at that moment, Medusa suddenly sensed some strong aroma. There was sourness, a sense of temperature, and even moisture. So she was sure it was the smell of the best coffee beans from the mountain on Seriphos Island. As you could already understand, Medusa just loves coffee, and it was a torment for her, because after the sanctions were imposed, there were no imports, and she had not drunk anything like that for 2 whole years. Then she walked on the water, thinking that there must be a special thing for coffee somewhere nearby. Then she thought that perhaps her imagination was playing tricks on her, but she quickly dismissed it, for she could recognize the smell of coffee anywhere, even dead. And so, as Medusa approached the other side of the shore, she suddenly saw that some small wooden box was stuck in the rocks. When the girl saw her, she was very surprised. Then she came closer and, taking it in her hands, swept the dew and excess dirt that was on it into the water. Upon closer inspection, Medusa realized that it was a crate of the finest coffee beans from the mountain on Seriphos Island. She really hoped that there would be only coffee and nothing else extra. However, at that moment she heard a strange sound from inside. All the snakes that were present on her head immediately became anxious. Medusa just stared at the box for a while. Then she decided to open it to see if everything was all right. And so when the girl did so and looked inside, she saw a small, very beautiful, and screaming child. Medusa immediately reached for it and began questioning how he even ended up in that box, and how he was able to cross an entire sea in it. But then she realized that he couldn't talk either. This made Medusa very angry, because she thought that these people had thrown the baby out because he couldn't talk. She thought they were idiots, and decided that she couldn't just let it go. But then suddenly her anger was interrupted by the voice of this little child. He was ready to cry. But the girl, when she paid attention to him, was immediately able to calm him down. She gave him a big hug and offered to go to her house. In fact, from that moment on, her life changed dramatically. Accompanied by this unknown creature who would change her fate, she went to her home to figure out what to do next. And so, when Medusa finally crawled, she was greeted by many different other creatures that lived on this island. When they saw her, they were very surprised, for the girl could not even walk anymore. She was crawling on the ground. They wondered what was happening to her, but when they saw the creature in her arms, they were even more worried. The creatures living there assumed that the child had been sacrificed again. But a lot of creatures immediately began to turn away from her, because to look into her eyes and you can immediately turn into stone forever. Medusa, for her part, as she crawled closer to them, began to hear all of their conversations, so she quickly raised her head and looked at them. People turned away and didn't even speak to her. In fact, she didn't understand how it could have happened, because she was walking along the beach, and then she was almost swept away by the waves. She could barely hold her baby in her arms, and as soon as she got ashore with great difficulty, immediately a bunch of crayfish attacked her from the sea and tried to prick her with their claws. Then, walking along a familiar road, a stone appeared from nowhere, and she stumbled, almost killing herself. But fortunately, the child was not hurt, for she had lifted him up in time. And then Medusa discovered that more of her cafe coupons she'd collected over the years had taken and disappeared. She couldn't understand what was going on, and assumed that the gods were punishing or testing her for something. But she was serious, and decided that she was happy to overcome such harsh realities. And so from that moment on, quite a bit more time passed. Finally, Medusa reached a very familiar road, and realized that it was only a short distance from home. The girl could even see him already, and realized that this day was definitely the unluckiest. She decided that in order to get home as soon as possible, she would make a run for it. So she turned to the baby and told him to hold on tight. And just when Medusa wanted to run, complications didn't leave her side. For one thing, a few days ago, a large wagon had passed this spot, and because of that, huge rocks appeared on the road that had never been there before. Usually Medusa didn't have to deal with rocks, but this was different. Suddenly the wind brought a leaf that covered her eyes completely, and a girl was passing nearby, carrying many sweet apples from Olympus. And unfortunately for Medusa, it all coincided so unluckily that she just flew straight up into the sky, screaming loudly. In the place where the girl had landed, a single sorceress was sitting. She looked into her magic ball and realized that something was finally coming out. The sorceress saw in her magic that a great misfortune was on its way, but she had no idea where it would come from, or more importantly, what it would be. And just as she was about to ask it of the magic ball, Medusa landed just a meter away with a baby in her arms. They all screamed loudly. The sorceress stepped back a few meters and looked at her in surprise, not knowing what was happening. Medusa, who was covered in wounds, smiled and said that it had been a bit of a breeze, but they had made it home. Then she turned to the witch, who was her sister, and said that she had finally returned. The girl could not utter a word because of her surprise. She wanted to ask how she'd gotten there, but Medusa said it had been a very bad day, and even she wouldn't tell. Well then, her sister replied that she didn't want to know anything herself, and said she was referring to the baby in her arms. Medusa smiled and said that she had found this little cutie and would take care of him from now on. Some idiots had thrown him into the sea, but she had found him, luckily. But her sister suddenly shouted, interrupting her, and said that the girl should get rid of him as soon as possible. She sighed heavily and said she couldn't even believe her eyes. It was a fateful child. A terrible aura wrapped around that child. And if it continued like this, it would eventually kill her. Medusa, hearing all these words, looked at her sister in surprise. Then she slowly turned her gaze to the cute little boy who was sitting in her arms. She was silent for a while. Then looking at her sister, she asked, "Has she had a few shots of alcohol since she's telling such tall tales?" But she only shouted back, saying that she was completely sober and had not even been drinking for a few days. The sister decided to prove her right, so she arranged a special ritual. She drew a circle on the floor and also some drawings. After that, she arranged candles for it. When everything was ready, she took the child and put him in the circle. The baby didn't understand anything. It was like a game to him. Medusa's sister said they were at least relatively safe now, so she decided to start a family meeting to talk it over. The girl, in turn, looked at her in surprise and asked what she had done to this small and defenseless child, and what relatively safe meant. He can't do anything. He can't even speak. However, the sister became even more serious and said that this was no joke. Her life was really in danger. This girl was the second of all the Gorgon sisters. Her name was Uriela. She turned back to the child and said she could feel a powerful, heroic aura emanating from him. She was about to name its power, but then suddenly looking closer, she saw that this child had quietly destroyed all of her magical defenses. He crawled up to Uriela and started chewing on her sweater. The girl, when she saw him, immediately cried out, "I don't understand how he managed to get through the seal and crawl that far." She told her sister that he looked incredibly sinister, and it was unclean power. But Medusa was surprised and asked what she was even talking about, since any kid can blow out candles and rip scotch tape off the floor. Uriela screamed even more and said it didn't matter. If that was to heed her words, for she could see perfectly well where this connection with the child would lead after all. Medusa took him in her arms and pretended to be very surprised. Then her sister asked her to stop fooling around, because there could be no mistake. This child was born to kill her. If she let it live, this prediction would definitely come true. In fact, among all three Gorgon sisters, only two were immortal, And just about the youngest of the sisters was Medusa, and she was mortal. She is a creature that is exactly what is destined to die. Her sister, while sitting behind a magic ball, saw that the foul creature with snakes instead of hair, and has the destiny to die at the hand of the hero. And when Uriela said all this to Medusa, she could not believe it. She said, looking at the child, that he had no strength at all, and she even felt sorry for him. The girl looked at her in surprise, then said her prediction again, but it didn't convince Medusa. The girl replied that, as she said, it was a child who had been thrown away by people like himself, and now he was still small and understood absolutely nothing. But when he grows up and finds out about it, he'll definitely be sad. She doesn't like people much either, but you can't hate a little kid like that, even if he's destined to kill her. Medusa believes that there's no point in believing in a prediction that hasn't even come yet and probably won't come for many more years. By then, things could have changed dramatically. Uriela sighed heavily and turned to her sister, wondering if she really wanted to keep him. The girl smiled and said that she could remind her how every time she tried to avoid the prophecy, it was still forgotten. And even worse, and it was exactly the same in this situation. Medusa believes that one may not harm or avoid him, but only try to befriend him and circumvent this terrible prophecy. The girl was still going to say something, but at that moment her sister interrupted her, and turning her attention to the boy, said that he had just taken just now and set fire to her hair directly. When Medusa saw this, she immediately started to put them out. She was very surprised, because the little boy could not even walk yet, but he already knew how to handle fire. Certainly the girl didn't know how he could move the candle and set it on fire, certainly, but somehow he still managed to do it. And so, when her sister finally put out her hair, Uriela turned to her and said that she could see for herself this child could be a burden to her, even if not on purpose. But the girl sighed heavily and said that maybe she was just a loser, and that's why things were going wrong. But her sister objected, and said that it was impossible to be a loser to that extent. Then Medusa laughed nervously and turned toward the boy and, calling him Percy, apologized, saying he must have been frightened. When Uriela heard this name, she was very surprised, but her sister objected and said that he must have some name for him to be able to respond. Then the sister objected and asked what she was even listening to her for. But the jellyfish objected and asked when she could have cared about her opinion in the first place. Under any circumstances, she's still going to raise him, and his sister knows that very well. She's been cool with it up until now, so it's going to be okay now. But Uriela objected and said that she'd brought normal kids up to this point, and she didn't know how many more times to repeat that this was a completely different case, and this little fake kid was out to bloody kill her. Well, the jellyfish still insisted and said she didn't know anything, because she had already made her final decision, which was not subject to any discussion. But when she looked at her sister, she asked in surprise what that evil look was. She smiled and said she wasn't afraid of her at all, so it wouldn't work on her. Uriela just stared at her for a while longer. Then, with a heavy sigh, she said that if she'd listened to her, there wouldn't be any rumors about them being con artists. And since that was the case, there was nothing left for them to do but move on to another plan. When Medusa heard about it, she was very surprised and asked what it was. The girl said it was just the house she had spoken of earlier. Such a way to have mercy on this child, and perhaps it would take pity on them. She looked at Percy and said that, like she'd said, they should try to make a relationship work. They would be allies, not enemies, and then maybe everything would be all right. Uriela, seeing the surprised look on the jellyfish's face, said that, to put it simply, they would create a family out of the unclean and the hero. She still couldn't believe she was saying such a thing. However, there is no way out for them anymore. Then Jellyfish asked in surprise, wondering if she still thought she shouldn't trust predictions that didn't even come true. She didn't understand how this little boy could hurt anyone. He's so cute. And at that moment she moved Percy as close to her sister as she could. However, Uriela, when she saw this, screamed loudly and ran some distance away from that vicious boy. And then, a little calmer, she looked into the face of this little one and remained silent for a while. He was also watching her, not even blinking. Sister suddenly thought about the fact that he was really a little bit cute, so she even wanted to stroke his head. She started to reach out her hand to do so, but at that moment, she was interrupted by a huge bolt of lightning that struck within an inch of the jellyfish. The girl looked at the sky in surprise and said that it was rather sudden, but it seemed to her that the weather wasn't overcast, and she didn't understand where the lightning had already come from. Uriela, who had been standing as close to this strike as possible, was a little burned and noticed that the road where the jellyfish had fallen was exactly where this lightning had struck. They were silent for a while, and then the girl told her sister that she didn't even want to be near him. Medusa wondered what was wrong this time, and then she explained that she'd almost been killed by lightning. But the jellyfish replied with an indignant look that it was all because she had given her a penetration. But Uriela, sighing heavily, said that anyone would have told her it was heaven's punishment. The girl sighed heavily and turned to her sister and said that she was too stubborn. The girl sighed heavily and turned to her sister, saying that she was too stubborn. She's just in a bad mood and sees everything as a threat. So I gave her Percy and told her to take him and stand for a while. Uriela grimaced as she held the baby in her arms, and she was even a little disgusted to do so, but the jellyfish told her to watch him briefly. She turned around and started to walk away, saying that even if she assumed she was telling the truth, asking if she really thought she could die. Medusa walked to the exit and said that even if it didn't happen at home, if she went outside, she would die immediately. And at that moment, the girl opened the door. Then the sister saw many stones suddenly sprinkled from the sky. Medusa, upon hearing that rumble, immediately turned there and stared in surprise. She couldn't believe that it had actually happened. Then someone's voice was heard from above, asking if anyone was hurt downstairs and apologizing, saying that he was the repairman of the Golden Garden. He explained that the rain came down very suddenly, so he dropped some stuff on the house. And he also said that he would clean it up a little later, so they could take it easy. The sisters stood silent. No one wanted to discuss the situation. But then the girl realized that, apparently, she really was destined for a fate that was impossible to avoid, and it was all the fault of that fated child. Uriela, after a while, turned to her sister and asked if she had seen her punch a hole in the roof that day. And just as she was trying to get out of the house, this happened. So she suggested that she just order a delivery and eat in peace. Medusa didn't mind, of course, because she didn't know what else she might encounter on her way to the diner. No one knows if the jellyfish will be able to escape its destined fate by showering this child with its love and care. She closed the door and went back to her sister, asking if they had anything at all at home to feed him. Some more time passed from then on, and Percy kept getting cranky, throwing various things all over the house. Medusa kept running after him and realized it was just a disaster. The boy was crying all the time, and there was no way she could calm him down. The girl turned to him and asked how much more whimpering could be done. Then she pulled her head closer and told him to look. See, even the snake's hair is moving from that horrible scream. Percy was briefly distracted by the snake, but he only began to yank it from side to side in anger. Medusa was certainly not pleased. However, she couldn't do anything about it. Then she heard her sister's voice, who said that it wouldn't work that way, so she suggested throwing it away. However, the girl was indignant and told her not to dare say such a thing. But Uriela, sighing heavily, said that this child was different from the others, so there was nothing they could do. They did not know how it should be treated. In fact, a few minutes before what was happening, they had sat the boy down on the table and told him that he would now eat. Medusa even found a small wooden spoon for him, saying that it was very good that there was leftover baby food at home. So she scooped up a whole spoonful of food and held it out to the boy, telling him to open his mouth. Percy stared at the spoon in surprise for a while, then opened his mouth, and the jellyfish gave him something to eat. She was really surprised that he ate a whole spoonful, but her sister, who was standing next to her, was outraged and said that she was feeding him like a normal creature. Medusa explained that he was just a simple child, so it was impossible to do otherwise. At this point, Percy began to chew suddenly, and afterward grudgingly spat out the spoonful of whatever the jellyfish had given him. The girls looked at him in surprise, Then Uriela was indignant and asked the Lord to help them, for he was very fastidious, and she knew that they would have many more problems with this boy. Then the jellyfish came closer to Percy and asked if he really didn't like this food. The boy didn't say anything back. Then she smiled and said it was no big deal. She still had all kinds of baby food left in her supplies, so they would use it all. She smiled and said that he must like something from this vast selection. And from that moment, a long time passed. But Percy still did not like anything because he was very hungry. He even began to be naughty, lying on the floor and screaming very loudly. The gargoyle family was already running low. They didn't understand why he didn't like anything after all. This food was quite tasty and even fresh. After a while, Uriela approached her sister and asked if she could not feed him, as she often looked after the children. And now she couldn't do such an easy task. Medusa said in a trembling voice that she didn't know how it happened, because it was the first time she had ever seen such a capricious person. But perhaps in his case, it is more correct to say that he is a self-sufficient person who knows what he wants but cannot deliver it. Then the sister excitedly inquired what else could be fed to him, for children scream very loudly without food. At this point, Percy was already so excited that he began to shout so loudly that the girl's ears almost rolled back. Uriela, seeing this, sighed heavily and said that he actually screamed. Medusa replied that she didn't even know what to do. After all, starving him is somehow not a good thing. The sister then asked in surprise if it really wouldn't be possible to do that. The girl was indignant and asked how she could say such a thing. She said that maybe if they gave him more food, something he would like after all. So they put a whole supply of their adult food in front of Percy. The boy just sat with his spoon for a while and looked at it all, and then ate some sweets, which he really enjoyed. Medusa, seeing this, could exhale with relief and said that she had to search the whole house, so something he had to eat from it after all. Uriela in turn became indignant and said that she had been told she had absolutely no food, so she called her sister names. Well, Jellyfish smiled and told her to stop nagging already, because he liked the candy, and she asked if he could just be put to sleep with it so he wouldn't scream anymore. Uriela looked at her in surprise and wondered if she really thought this was normal food. He wouldn't get sick of it and would start screaming again soon enough. Then the jellyfish, smiling, said that now it was time to try the first candidate, and that would be organic rice grown under the beautiful Atiku sun. She placed the dish in front of the boy, saying that it was baby food of the highest quality, which was made with lots of natural vegetables. There were no chemicals in it, and the child who tries this dish will definitely not be able to resist, so she will eat it whole. Percy was sure to like it, so she took one spoonful and held it out to him, telling him to try it. But Percy didn't even bother to try. He immediately slapped his hand on that spoon so that all the food fell to the ground. Medusa looked at him in surprise. She was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and said that he didn't like it after all. His sister laughed out loud when she saw it, because she knew he wouldn't eat it. But the girl, sighing heavily, gathered all her strength into a fist and said that there was nothing wrong with it, and she had the power to cook another dish that he might like. And so some time had passed since then. Jellyfish brought a mini rice ball into the room that was made especially for little boys like him. She smiled and said that everyone would like it because of its cute shape. She immediately held it out to the boy. Percy was interested, for the food did look pretty, and when he tried a small piece, he chewed for a while, and after that he just spit all the food out on the floor. Uriela, when she saw this, couldn't contain her laughter again. It was so loud and sincere that it made the jellyfish even angrier. Then she turned to her sister, and her snakes were immediately aimed at her. They looked at her in such a way that she immediately began to stonewall. At that moment, the jellyfish had already prepared a new dish, and turning back to Percy, offered to try it. Her sister, who stood all still and could not move, said in a low voice that it was rude, and asked how dare she treat her like that at all. But the jellyfish didn't even turn toward her and told her to shut up already, for she would be back in shape very soon. But Percy, in his turn, knocked over the cauldron of food the girl had brought him. Uriela laughed again and said that he did not even like her plate. Then the jellyfish prepared another dish and served it to him in another plate. But the boy did not want to eat it either, but threw it away with his foot. For some more time, the girl presented him with various dishes, while her sister continued to stand stone still, for still the spell had not been broken, and now he was still lying there crying after the many dishes he had tried that were simply a failure. Uriela sighed heavily and said that she already had an incredible headache and couldn't take any more of this screaming. Medusa looked at her in surprise and wondered what she was even suggesting. He didn't like this. He didn't like that. She turned to Percy and asked if he really wanted to see his mommy wither away and just die. But then suddenly her sister had an ingenious idea in her head, and she offered to turn him into a statue. But the jellyfish was outraged and said that if she said one more word, she would be a corpse. Uriela was outraged and said that she could not tolerate his presence in the house. He was too loud and nasty. But Jellyfish was outraged and started yelling at her sister, telling her to be kinder at last. But the girl said that this species is incredibly strange. After all, they are monsters who look out for a human cub, much less one born to kill them all. Medusa was indignant and told her to knock it off, because they weren't going to give him anywhere. Then the sister said, "I told her that when their eldest comes back, she'll be in trouble." Well, Jellyfish started yelling at her and said that she was a coward herself. That's why she was covering up with her sister. They continued to argue, but suddenly they heard a strange silence. The girls immediately turned toward Percy and saw that he had gone quiet and was holding a huge red apple in his hands. They stared in surprise for a while, and when they saw him start to bite it, they immediately shouted out in joy that he was eating after all. The jellyfish came up to him and rejoiced, saying that they had finally found something he would eat. She watched the baby gnaw on this huge apple with his little teeth and said that he liked the fruit after all. Uriela was indignant and asked if she couldn't have brought them earlier and asked what to do now. I wondered if he would only eat apples. Medusa was now energized and enthusiastic. She said there was nothing wrong with that. They had learned what Percy liked, which meant they could expand their horizons and cook him similar dishes. My sister said that she can certainly speak very beautifully, but it's too hard to make it real. Medusa replied that since Percy liked apples, she should try making porridge first. She turned to her sister and told her to follow her. They should do it together. Uriela, hearing that she had to attend as well, asked why it was necessary. Medusa explained that when they fed Percy faster, the two of them would finally be silent. The girl went to a small back room and said that luckily she had bought some apples the other day to stock up on. Her sister took the baby in her arms and held it away from her, then told the jellyfish that there was too much dust. But the girl, opening the sack, said that there was nothing wrong with it. The main thing is that it is edible. But when she looked inside, she saw a lot of terrible apples which are impossible even to look at. Medusa laughed nervously and said that they were already spoiled. She laughed nervously and said that they were already spoiled. Uriela, her face twisted from the stench, asked if the girl had decided to take up the elixir of eternal youth for the time being. Medusa was in no mood for jokes, so she asked her to be quiet and not to escalate the situation. With a heavy sigh, Jellyfish tossed the bag of apples aside and said that they were spoiled after all, and there was nothing left for them to do but buy new ones. Her sister looked at her in surprise and asked how she was going to do it. Medusa didn't understand her claim and asked what she meant. Uriela pointed her finger at the boy she held in her arms and asked where she was even going to put him for the time being. For a while they sat in complete silence, trying to figure out what to really do. Medusa smiled and said that she would leave him at home and asked her sister if she would do a good job for her. The girl sighed heavily. She didn't really have a choice, so she agreed to stay with the baby. However, Percy, as soon as the jellyfish began to gather, immediately began to roar as if out of breath. The girl could barely contain her emotions and told him in a calm voice to stop crying, for she had to go to the market to feed him. Medusa smiled and said that it was not safe for him to go out yet, so he needed to stay in this place with his aunt. Then she took a strand of her hair, which had a snake in it, and pointed to it to distract him. Percy stared at the snake for a while, calming down a bit, and the girls finally thought with relief that they could exhale. But the boy was even more furious. He screamed 3 times as much and pulled the jellyfish's hair so hard that she thought he was going to pull it out by the roots. Uriela didn't expect this to happen and started screaming herself. Then her sister asked her to stop already and help her better. The girl replied that in that case they would go to the bazaar together. You see, she is not going to be alone with him for such a long time. And so when they went outside and had already come to the right place, all the creatures who were there began to turn around and even whispered behind their backs when they saw that they had a child. Medusa was very angry, and as she passed by, she asked what they were staring at, if they wanted to be statues in the garden. Percy, on the other hand, began to look around and finally calmed down a little. You see, there was so much to see and do that he'd forgotten he'd even wanted to eat. Medusa in turn smiled and said that it was very unusual. But it's called a market, she said. Also that finally the people for the first time in a long time could get out. And here they're all staring as if they've never seen them before in their lives. But at that moment she turned to the side and saw a huge wave of water coming straight at them. She managed to react in time and covered herself and the baby with an umbrella. Whoever had let that water in immediately asked if they were okay. Medusa exhaled with relief and said they were fine, but it could have been worse if she hadn't brought her umbrella. She turned to Percy, asking if he was all right. The boy only put his arm around her neck. She said happily that it was a good thing she'd brought the umbrella, because even the road after the lid was a special kind of adventure. On the way to the market, there were so many misfortunes that they could cripple themselves with, and Jellyfish sighed heavily and thought that she must really be a real loser since she couldn't even walk to the market in peace. But at that moment, a girl suddenly came up to her and asked if she was all right, because she saw the confused look on her face. She was holding a huge bowl of water and asked the girl if she had accidentally hurt herself anywhere. This stranger was Hesperides, the nymph who guarded the garden of the Hesperides, and seeing the girl closer, she asked if she was really a jellyfish. She laughed nervously and wondered if she had just splashed water all over her. Hesperides apologized in a trembling voice and said that while she was cleaning while she was dribbling on the water, she had accidentally hit her, apparently. Medusa kept screaming and said that she apparently couldn't open her eyes and asked that she was telling the truth. Did she really know it was her? And that's why she set it up like that on purpose. The girl replied in a trembling voice that it was not like that at all. Then they heard another voice coming toward Hesperides and asked if everything was all right. Jellyfish turned and saw another young girl with bright red hair. It was the second girl who was guarding the garden, and when she saw Jellyfish, she looked at her in surprise. She came closer to her and pointing her hand at the jellyfish, asked if it was bothering her sister again, and told Hesperides to get away from that snake. The girl in her turn replied that her sister had misunderstood everything, and it was her own fault for what had happened. The girl looked at her in surprise and asked her what she meant by that, and said that it was obvious that the jellyfish had nothing better to do, so she picked on her. Medusa in turn got angry. She did not want to tolerate all these accusations and asked who she thought she was, and did she really think she had decided to swim in the ocean on the way. The second keeper of the garden asked if she really thought that her sister had deliberately thrown all that water on her. The girls got into a very serious argument and were even ready to fight with each other. Edie turned to her sister and Dusa in a spirited voice, telling them not to fight, because somewhere she was to blame for everything after all. Then Hesperides II replied that you can't just dismiss this, for after all, the Gorgon sisters are very approachable. But at that moment Percy, who had been sitting silent all this time, suddenly looked out from behind her shoulder and made a loud noise. The guardian of the garden, seeing this, immediately turned to her, asking the jellyfish if she had stolen a human child again. The girl got very angry and asked how much more she could repeat, since she hadn't stolen anyone. But Hesperides II in turn told her not to talk nonsense, for there was no reason at all for children to follow a monster like her, and also wondered where all the past ones had gone, and with a smile on her face added that she must have eaten them. At this point, the jellyfish gave the perpetrator of the whole argument a baby, telling her to support him. After that, the girl became so thoroughly enraged that all her jellyfish began to move quickly, hissing and looking specifically at the keeper. Hesperides II asked if she was really asking for this duel, and then said that since she was about to feel the full power of the fiery fist. At that moment, Jellyfish thought about how she had been like an idiot making up various horrible nicknames for herself, and now she was bragging about them. Then the girl who was holding the child in her arms stepped aside, saying that they had better move away because her sister and his mother are the most frightening creatures in anger, so it is better not to be near them at this moment. They went off somewhere away behind some bushes, and sitting down on a rock, the girl said it was much better that way, and looking at the boy, asked him what had brought him to this place. Percy yelled something in response, and the girl lifted him up, saying that he probably had a reason. Medusa often looked after children who had nowhere to go back to, and he wasn't the first one she'd had. At that moment, the boy looked in the direction from which the duel between his new mother and that girl could be seen. Hesperides said that the jellyfish are very fastidious and aggressive, and there is a particularly bad relationship between their families, which is why they always fight when they meet. Still, she smiled at Percy and said that she'd seen jellyfish raise kids like him. Though she didn't believe her sister's rumors, she was pretty sure she was a good person, and her sisters weren't as bad as you'd think. The girl turned to the side where the fight between the jellyfish and Hesperides was taking place, and said that from now on, he would often have to watch these two clash. However, he had better try not to think too negatively about it. Percy watched the fight with one eye, but he felt a little sad, so he reached out to pull the girl closer. The girl felt that his whole body was too wet, because the water had gotten on him. She put him down on a rock and told him that this would not do, that he needed to be dried immediately, so she asked him to sit still and be by himself for a while. Percy, who still didn't understand some of the words, looked at her in surprise and saw her walk between the two, trying to pull them apart. When the boy got tired of watching all this, he slowly got up from the rock and headed off somewhere in the direction of the forest. He looked around and suddenly stopped when he saw the beautiful sight of trees that glistened their green in the sunlight. Then a brightly colored butterfly began to fly slowly past the boy, and it didn't even stop. It flew away, and Percy was very interested in it. At this point, Hesperida was finally able to calm her sister down a bit, telling her to calm down for once, and explained that it was all because of her. However, the second Hesperides was angry and asked what it was she was saying, but then sighed heavily and said that she would forgive, so be it, but it was just for once. Medusa, who was ready to throw a few more punches already, sighed heavily and said she needed to finish her sentences. But she turned her attention at that moment to a girl who came up to them and immediately asked where Percy was. Hesperides, for her part, turned aside and said he was sitting there, but when she saw no one on the rock, she asked in surprise where he had disappeared to. Medusa got even more angry and questioned how she could manage to lose a child in such a short time, and asked what she was going to do now. The girl hid behind her sister's back and apologized in a trembling voice, saying he was so small and she didn't think he could run anywhere. However, the jellyfish interrupted her and shouted, and said that just because he was small, she should have looked after him much more carefully. Hesperides II sighed heavily and told her to stop yelling already, for she would help her find him. The girl, rolling her eyes, also said that even though she pissed her off, it wasn't the child's fault, so she would help her after all. They didn't argue much longer, so they went in different directions and started shouting his name in order to find the boy. Hesperides stepped aside and sighed heavily, thinking that he would be safe if they could find him as soon as possible, for there were bad rumors about this forest in the area. Percy, on the other hand, who was interested in the butterfly, ran right after it. He was already somewhere deep in the forest, and even if he had wanted to, he could not have found his way back. The boy was so engrossed in chasing the animal that he didn't even notice the silhouette of a man appearing in front of him. Because he was too small and low, he couldn't see who it was, but only felt some terrible energy. Medusa, in turn, when she got back together with the girls, said that it was necessary to find him as soon as possible, because in such a situation there was nothing to be done. We would have to use the most reliable way, namely to ask for help from her sisters. The Hesperides, when they heard this, were a little surprised, and one of them asked, "Are these really the same jellyfish from the legends in the books?" At this moment, one of the girls also thought that it would probably be easier to put out a wanted notice for this child. Then it would be found much faster, and without any ancient ancestors. At this very time, Jellyfish and her enemies went to the one place where her sister always was. She was a sorceress, and when one of her clients came to her, She told her that she thought she was not destined to be a young lady. The client was very surprised and asked why that was so, but the girl objected and said that they were not giving reasons. They were only voicing her fate, which helped her to adjust, or they were looking for other ways. At that moment, the door to the tent suddenly opened, and the voice of a jellyfish was heard, addressing her sister. The girls immediately looked at her in surprise, and Jellyfish got straight to the point, saying she needed to find someone, so asked her for help. The customer who saw it started screaming loudly, saying that it was a horrible monster. Medusa in turn objected and told her to know that not everyone would want to hear that about her. The sorceress in turn reassured the mistress and said that some had already finished, so she could go. Then the tent was closed for a temporary break. It was Gray, Jellyfish's biological sister, and she turned to her and told her that she was indeed hopeless. She had always called her unlucky, so she asked what was wrong now. Gray also said that if she didn't show up, she would have ripped off money from the afternoon customers, because she has to make a living somehow, and the jellyfish is really distracting her right now. However, the girl said she would give her 10 coupons for coffee, so she asks if she can find her some. The biological sister asked if she was really trying to pay her off with some coffee coupons, and wondered how only she had a conscience, since she'd always called her a gray-haired, one-eyed, obnoxious monster. And now she wants to put her business on hold by making it up to her with a few coupons. Then she sighed heavily and said that she would help her, and also asked me if she knew who she should look for, because her destiny was to hunt for death, and she felt it very well. Medusa sighed heavily, and her sister said that this child would really kill her, so she needed to be very careful. This very time, Percy was sitting across from this unknown man, who even had a very sharp-bladed axe in his hands. Medusa sighed heavily, and said that apparently they still didn't realize that she didn't believe in these fates. Gray sighed heavily, and asked if there was anything in her but stubbornness, but the girl still asked if she could find it. After all, she is a master of her craft. The sister, for her part, said that she had already found him. He is the son of the gods and carries the destiny of a hero, and there is someone very large and formidable standing next to him now. When Medusa heard this information, she immediately started to leave the tent. Then they looked at her in surprise and asked where she was going. Then the enchantress turned to the 2 Hesperides and asked if they would like to know their fate. The girls at once shouted out in one voice that they wished for nothing. Hesperides II jumped out of the tent and, turning to the jellyfish, asked her where she was going in the first place. The girl, without turning, replied that apparently she had guessed where he might be, and also told them to follow Neve. It was their responsibility, and they must not forget it. At this time, Percy sat on a rock and looked at this unknown man. The creature, in turn, wondered if this was really a creature that belonged to the human race. Then it pondered, and said that he wouldn't have been able to get into these lands after all, in which case there was only one explanation as to how he could have ended up here. The unknown creature thought for a while, and then said that it was probably all the work of a jellyfish. Percy, when he heard the familiar name, immediately called it, and continued to stare at the unknown creature in surprise. At this very time, the jellyfish came to the Radon dragon, who was guarding the golden apple, and asked that he give it to her. The dragon, who possessed 3 heads, shook them and asked what she was even talking about. The girl kept shouting for him to hear her, and told him not to make a fool of himself, for she inquired if the child had come to this place, and also asked where he was. Radon asked in surprise if she had taken someone in again. The girl asked him to stop all this talk, and asked him if he had eaten that poor man. The dragon answered that he had never had such hobbies before, and it was obviously a misunderstanding. At this point, the Hesperides ran up and apologized to the dragon, saying it was all because of the jellyfish. They were just worrying about something and looking for it, so he shouldn't worry. It wasn't his fault. Then the dragon immediately guessed that it was all the work of Hercules, who kept warning the jellyfish to stop bringing people into their world. One of the dragon heads said that it took him a long time to recover the head he had kindly chopped off. They've been avoiding him ever since. They're noisy, and they stink. Then the jellyfish said cheerfully that since it wasn't his brother who had taken Percy, so she asked him to help her find him. Radon looked at her in surprise and asked if she had not listened to them. But then suddenly one of the heads lifted her up and said that the smell of a man came only from the direction of her house. Medusa said it makes sense, since they're raising the baby there and everything smells like him. At this very time, Percy was sitting on the shoulders of this stranger, who had chopped himself some firewood and sat him on his neck, giving the boy an apple to snack on. They walked slowly through the woods, and suddenly Percy turned sideways, hearing some extraneous sounds. Then he saw a jellyfish run up to the stranger and shout in a leap to let the boy go. Well, halfway through, she suddenly stops, seeing a familiar face, and falling to the ground, asks if they are really her sister already. Medusa sat on the ground and scratched the back of her head nervously. Her sister, for her part, asked her to stop attacking people without even figuring out who they were first. Percy, seeing his new mom, smiled and held out an apple, showing that he now had food. This person was Sphina, the oldest sister of all the Gorgons, and she turned to the jellyfish and said that she had almost hit her, and asked her to remember that they were sisters and could fight as equals. At that moment, Jellyfish was very embarrassed. She knew she had screwed up, but her sister hadn't even gotten hurt because of her. So she didn't understand why she had to make such a big deal out of it. Shortly after their conversation, they finally returned home, and Sphina said that she didn't understand why the jellyfish would shelter the child again without permission, because she could bet that Uriela wasn't thrilled about it. Uriela, for her part, when she saw that they had finally returned, was overjoyed, and told her sister that the jellyfish had brought the strange child into the house again. Sphina replied that she could already see that, but then looked at the boy and said that he was pretty smart. The sister was outraged and asked what she was talking about, since he was a threat to all of them. The girl was surprised and asked if it was really true, because she had been out for firewood and met him. They talked for a while, and it turned out that he was quite smart and intelligent. When Medusa heard this, she asked in surprise what she was talking about, for Percy was still a child and could not speak. He's not old enough to make such complicated sounds. However, the sister resented it and said that she felt it anyway. The dignity of a strong man is hidden in him, and she feels a power that cannot be suppressed no matter how deep it is hidden. Uriela, at this point, ran up to her older sister and turned to her, and asked if she was really going to let the jellyfish do whatever it wanted. Sphina said after thinking about it, even after hearing their explanation, the situation was still complicated. However, she thought they should still listen to the jellyfish, even though their enemy is this man. However, he is still a child, so maybe they should leave it resolved. Doesn't bring any problems yet. Medusa, when she heard this, was immediately overjoyed. She hadn't really hoped her sister would allow it, but she was pleasantly surprised to hear her positive response. But Uriela, of course, was not delighted with the news, and turning to her sister, said that the jellyfish seemed to be in danger. Sphina, in an indignant voice, replied that she knew it very well. She was about to ask if the girl was just going to let it go, but Jellyfish interrupted and said she should stop worrying. Since even her older sister had agreed to have the baby, Uriela turned to her sister with her head down, saying she was worried about her after all, but Jellyfish waved her hand and told her not to overprotect. Everything would be fine. She was sure of it. Then she walked over to Percy and took him in her arms and spun him around, saying he was an incredibly cute baby. She put her arm around him and told him to come to his mommy. Then she looked at her sister and said that she could see he wasn't talking yet. Then turning to the other sister, she asked how such a cutie could possibly be capable of killing someone if it was going to happen in the very distant future. But at that moment, Percy suddenly uttered his first word, namely, the name of the jellyfish. And when the girl heard it, looked at him in surprise, everyone was also surprised that he actually said the word. Percy repeated the word again, and the jellyfish asked in surprise if he had really learned to speak. The jellyfish asked in surprise if he had really learned to speak. Everyone was very surprised and said that this child was growing very fast, and Uriela was very panicked and said that it was a sinister child that could kill them very soon. Some time had passed since then, and the girls went to the kitchen to prepare some food for him. Percy, on the other hand, was getting cranky and tugging at the jellyfish's dress. The girl looked down and said they were cooking, so he shouldn't be cranky, or he'd distract them and it would take longer. Uriela stood at a distance from him and squinted her eyes and told the girl to be careful. If it's a kid out there, he might kill her himself. Medusa in turn looked at Percy, who was very displeased, and wondered if he was being cranky because he was hungry, or if he was trying to take her somewhere else. Uriela moved closer to her sister and told her that he was just trying to take her to the afterlife, but she resented it and asked her to stop talking nonsense already. Medusa glanced at Percy, who sat down unhappily to the side and glared at her. She sat down and held out a plate to him, telling him that he must be hungry, but they had some porridge already cooked, thankfully. She gave him one little spoonful at a time, and Percy ate it all with a disgruntled face, but after another spoonful of this gruel he spat it all out on the ground. Medusa was very upset, and asked the boy what was happening to him and why he didn't want to eat anything, because it was porridge made from apples. Uriela was about to ask her sister something, but she interrupted her and told her that if she said a single word like that, she would turn her to stone. But the girl said she didn't mean anything bad at all. Looking at Percy, he must want to go out, for he was pulling her as if he wanted to go somewhere. Medusa immediately looked at her surprised, and couldn't believe that his sister had actually started to care about him. Sphina in turn said that she was right, for when he had come home with her, he had looked quite happy, and he must need some fresh air. The girl hesitated and said that she did not know what to do, for it was not so easy to accomplish. Medusa also said that she's worried that they might lose Percy if he goes alone. Last time, he luckily found Sphina and came back with her, but no one knows how it might go this time. She thought about it and said she'd have to think of something to keep him in the house, and she wasn't at all happy about the situation. Medusa said she had just found a way to get out of the house safely with Percy. She'd been walking around the market for a while, going over her options. Since they got along with some of those sissy brute sisters, they could consult with them. The girl was actually referring to the Hesperides, who had a great many sisters who looked incredibly similar to each other. The first method the jellyfish suggested was to swaddle him and take him on her back. This was the simplest and oldest method, so they could tie him tightly to each other, and they would have no chance of losing the baby. They went outside to try this method, and the jellyfish said it was pretty good and solved the problem so easily. But at that moment, her sister, who had come out to help, said that she had missed something. Medusa immediately turned in her direction and asked what she had missed. But at that moment, a stone passed right in front of her face with great speed and then hit a tree nearby. Uriela turned to her, saying that's exactly what she had missed. She doesn't know if it just happened by accident or on purpose. But she also told her sister that there is a very good chance of weird, unfortunate things happening when this child is around. And if she paces around with him in her arms, it will go on all day long. Thus, the first attempt was a failure. Medusa was still a little hurt from this, and her nose was bleeding. Her second method was to carry the boy in a stroller. It would be a bit of a nuisance, of course, but that way with Percy at least there was somewhere to keep station. So, Jellyfish suggested doing a few laps to see if that would be a viable way to go. They stepped aside for a while, and immediately crows started flying around the jellyfish and attacking it, nibbling all over its body. She started to run away quickly, causing her to trip and fall right on top of that stroller. Luckily, Percy wasn't hurt. Uriela, who was standing off to the side watching the whole thing, summarized and said that it wouldn't do. She wouldn't be able to drive the stroller, so that plan also failed. Medusa, whose back was starting to hurt badly, said that didn't work either, so she offered to stop and tolerate the baby's screaming for a bit. Her sister, surprised, looked at her and asked if she was giving up so quickly, but the jellyfish said something should come out the third time, so she agreed to the last method. She took a rope out of the house and tied it around Percy's body. For a while the girl just stared at it. Medusa said it probably wouldn't work that way either, but her sister suggested she at least try that method. Of course, as you could guess, this method didn't work either. The sister, who was sitting there peeling apples to make a hearty lunch for the child, thought that she should try her best as soon as possible. After that, the girls had some more plans, like tying the boy to balloons. Uriela said it looks too dangerous, and weather conditions could affect it. Medusa then suggested keeping Percy in a king-sized hoop and moving around that way. Her sister asked if she wasn't tired of trying all these methods yet, but the girl replied that they would be walking around in virtual reality. But Uriela said that was too much, and Medusa thought about the fact that it really was. They tried a few more methods and Medusa sighed heavily as she fell to the ground, asking why there was nothing easier. Uriela thought for a while and then said that, on second thought, maybe they could leave him out front to play. They couldn't take him anywhere, but he'd be safe here, and they could always see if he was all right. Medusa was outraged and said that was very irresponsible, so that option would definitely not work for them. And then she said that it would be much easier if her sister took him in her arms and just followed her around all day. So she really liked the idea and suggested that they should really do that. Uriela, hearing this, became indignant and asked if she was crazy. Why should she even be doing this? She's scared and won't do it. She also said she had nothing to do with Persia. She was afraid of his heroic might. Medusa was indignant and wondered why she was making that racket again. But then suddenly, just as she was about to scold her sister, the girls came up to them. It was the Hesperides, and one of them asked if they had been bullying the baby all this time. The other one looked out and said hello. She apologized for the last time it happened. She was curious how the baby was doing, so she and her sister came in to check things out. Well, Medusa was already incredibly angry about even being tired, and said that if she was interested, she could come alone and not drag her sister along, and asked that they leave. Hesperides II became indignant and said that she too actually didn't want to come, but she was even more reluctant to leave her little sister alone with them. The girl was indignant and didn't understand what they were even here for. She wasn't going to come to her originally either, because all Gorgon sisters are total losers. Medusa became incredibly angry and ran to battle her bitter adversary, saying that she wouldn't just leave it at that. But then my older sister, who had already peeled a lot of apples, came out of the apartment and asked what all the fuss was about. The girls immediately fell silent and looked at Sphina, who looked rather intimidating. The girl looked very serious and said she didn't even know they would have guests. Then she asked her sisters to peel potatoes for an appetizer, as they were to be served. She also looked at them and asked if the two of them were just about to fight. Medusa immediately hugged her worst enemy and said that of course not, because they were such close friends. Her sister was satisfied with that answer, and said that in that case, they could enjoy some potatoes together, and they did sit down to eat some. Hesperides began to feed the baby, while her older sister sat next to Medusa and asked if she had fixed the problem that had occurred. The girl, who was engrossed in eating, didn't immediately respond. She then said that she hadn't figured it out yet, and with a heavy sigh said that apparently there was no way to figure it out, so they were very unlucky. She also said that she's already tried a lot of things. However, it's all too stressful. She thinks they should just wait until Percy finally learns to walk. Sphina, hearing this, thought for a moment, and then she said that in that case the problem would indeed be solved. Suddenly they heard Persia repeat the last word and begin to walk with his little feet. When Hesperide the youngest saw this, she immediately exclaimed with joy, saying that he could already stand. When Medusa saw this, she was immediately overjoyed. She ran up to the boy and said that it was unbelievable. It was the first time she had ever met such an advanced child who could not speak or even walk in one day. She jumped up and said that now they could go out together, and so she suggested that they all have a party. And also, turning to the Hesperides sisters, she asked that they sit up until evening, for they would go out to eat together and celebrate the occasion. The younger sister was happy about it, but the older sister wasn't so happy about it and sighed heavily and said she would just go home because she didn't want to be a part of it. But then suddenly Sphina spoke up and said in a rough voice that they should go eat already. Hesperide had no choice but to agree, for she was really afraid of their elder sister. Just like that, they all had a very nice meal and celebrated this great event. However, some time had passed since then, and the baby started to get cranky again. The sisters couldn't take it anymore. You see, Percy was screaming very loudly and rolling from side to side. Sphina, watching it all with a stony expression, said she had never seen him so loopy before. Then she turned to Medusa, telling her that she shouldn't be so stressed out and should calm down, or she would soon go completely bald because of such stress. But the other sisters said that the snakes on Medusa's head cannot fall out, for they are there forever. The girl herself in turn said that if this is not the case, then it is better to refrain from these comments, because they do not make it any easier. In fact, a few minutes before, things had been very even, and Medusa suggested that everyone go say hello to the family and introduce Percy to everyone. Uriela, who was sitting at her rituals, was very surprised to hear this, and immediately wondered if she would have to go somewhere. Well, Medusa replied that of course it was obligatory, in case when she and Percy went for a walk something happened to her and he was left alone. What should be done in such a case? The girl wondered why she didn't just stay home in that case, but Medusa didn't understand the nonsense, and said that in any case, if she sent her off alone and something happened, it would be on her sister's conscience. Medusa said it doesn't matter at all what her sister thinks about it because she has to go too. She's already planned everything out, and the girl is part of this trek. She also said that she had found in the closet and gathered all the clothes that Percy could wear, so she suggested that they gather soon and welcome the family already. Medusa turned to him and said that was right. Those were his clothes, and offered to say hello this time to Aunt Cry and Uncle Randon, who helped them. She also said that he could wear what he liked. However, when she saw Percy wearing a down jacket and glasses, she was very surprised. The sisters were silent for a while. Then Medusa came up to him and asked him why he was wearing winter clothes, because it was incredibly hot outside and he would feel bad. And then she wondered if he did it because it looked unusual. But when she took off her glasses, she saw the boy's shining eyes and said that he must be delighted with her. Medusa wondered if that was overkill. She also said that she didn't know what human world he lived in. However, in this place, everything is guarded by the gods, so they don't have a change of seasons. So many winter clothes can be very bad. But at that moment, Percy, hearing what she forbids him to wear, began to cry. She began to show him other options, telling him to look and think some more, for she had prepared him many different clothes that he might like, for they were quite colorful too. The girl handed him the brightly colored overalls, asking if he might like this better than the video. It was incredibly beautiful and even comfortable. He didn't like the overalls, however, so he looked at his new mother with a frustrated look. She, in turn, was about to move closer and accidentally tripped. And after a while, Medusa managed to hold on and not fall. She immediately turned to him and told him that she had learned to keep her balance, and now even if she suddenly started to fall, it would not be so easy to do so. Her sister, who continued to sit on the sidelines, seeing all of this, thought to herself that this was just some kind of circus, and she didn't understand why she was even acting like this. Then Medusa rose to her feet and handed Percy her jumpsuit again, saying that this outfit was quite beautiful, and suggested that he put it on, but it made the boy even more angry. He jumped on Medusa and started pulling her hair with all his might. The girl turned to her sister, telling her to stop just standing there and watching, and to help her as soon as possible. Uriela ran up and quickly began to take Percy down. After a while they managed to do it after all. Medusa lay on the floor and sighed heavily, and said that she would just die now, never tiring of repeating that the stubbornness of children knows no limit. But the sister suggested that he should just leave it as it was, for he could not be persuaded. But the girl objected, and said that she could not let him go out in winter clothes. Then she went to Percy, and asked him if he really wanted to see his mother die. Uriela, for her part, requested that she just leave him alone, either put up with his choice of clothing or they would just stay home. Of course, their families have never really interacted, so she didn't think it was necessary to start being friends now, or to show any desire to meet. But Medusa was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, so she turned to her sister and told her not to push it. Sphina suddenly walked over to them and said thoughtfully that perhaps he really was best left in the one he had chosen. Medusa looked at her sister with disdain and asked if she really thought that. She said that no matter how much she explained to Percy, he wouldn't understand. After all, he was just a child, and it's probably better to let him do what he wants to do now rather than trying to break him. Medusa thought for a moment. She put on her sunglasses and took Percy, who was dressed in winter clothes. She put on her sunglasses, took Percy, who was dressed in winter clothes, and so they went outside. The girl looked up and breathed in the fresh summer air and said it was a beautiful, hot and sunny day. Percy, on the other hand, who was in a very warm down jacket, as soon as he came out, immediately began to sweat, his cheeks even turning red from it. Medusa wanted to take him to his relatives. However, he was stubborn and stopped. She immediately looked at him, asking, "What's wrong?" When the girl looked at him and saw the many drops of sweat running down the boy, she asked with a smile on her face, "Is he really hot?" And then she thought that really, as her sister had said, Children don't understand anything until they've experienced it for themselves. So she gave in and suggested that Percy go and change his clothes so that he wouldn't suffocate from the heat. So when they returned, Medusa immediately began helping the boy change his clothes. Uriela stood behind the wall and watched. My older sister, when she came over and saw it, was very surprised. But she, because she was chopping wood, didn't pay much attention to it, and didn't question what was even going on. Uriela turned to her and asked if she was really going to continue to allow this child to be raised. Sphina looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she meant. Then she said that even if she didn't know the details, she thought she knew what she was talking about, because Medusa was used to it and didn't notice anything at all. Uriela explained that this child had brought nothing but misfortune to the jellyfish, and now that she could give up something harmless, it could be the cause of her death. She asked her sister, shouldn't they do something about it before all this happened? Sphina looked at her arrogantly and asked if she was at it again, but the girl immediately lowered her head and replied that she wasn't suggesting to do away with this child at all, however, because the jellyfish was their precious sister, whom they had been taking care of for a very long time. Sphina went on about her business and said thoughtfully that there was some truth in what she said after all. And she's worried enough too, because jellyfish is still very kind, though she can be quite rude, and there's no way she'd listen to them if they suggested she send Percy somewhere. And if they did something like that, it would surely break her heart. At this time, Jellyfish had already come to the dragon with Percy in her arms, and said that they had come to say hello and get acquainted. Sphina said that in that case, all they had to do was look after their sister and this child. It was the best thing they could do to protect her and not hurt her tender feelings. Uriela was silent for a while. Then she said that she still wasn't sure. She didn't know how she could accept this child at all, knowing that he could kill her sister at any moment. Of course, sometimes she and Jellyfish quarrel, but still she does not understand how she can love with all her soul a child who not only brings misfortune, but also can take the life of her favorite little sister. Sphina, hearing this, immediately thought about it. Then, with a heavy sigh, she stroked her sister's head and said that she understood her perfectly. However, she advised her not to make any hasty decisions. Everything would be fine. They would always be there for the jellyfish and would be able to help her at any time if she needed it. Uriela, for her part, thought she was incredibly stupid and obliged to do something to save her sister. It had been quite some time since then, and Jellyfish had already returned home. She and her sister were doing something, and Percy was walking around them, yelling all the time. Uriela, turning to her sister, asked if she could get him to calm down. Then the girl turned to Percy and asked him to stop a little and calm down. The boy stopped, and for a while just looked at his feet. The girl was very surprised and asked what was wrong. She decided that he must have been worried about what she had said, and said that it was only Uriela, so he shouldn't take her seriously. Percy, however, continued to just stand there and look down. Jellyfish was alarmed and said that it was the first time she had ever seen the fidgeter stand like that. The boy sat down on the ground and then stood up again. He repeated this several times, and the sisters began to watch carefully, for it alarmed them. Percy then pushed himself off the ground and ran very fast. Medusa immediately jumped up and followed him. She couldn't believe that he had really learned to run so fast. She picked up her phone to film it, and told her sister that he was now running instead of walking, and she couldn't hold back the tears because it was a historic moment. Uriela watched all this with displeasure and said that the jellyfish was the ultimate smudge. The girl ran up to Percy and started taking pictures of him from different angles. She said that he was amazing because he had learned to run so quickly, and that was worth a lot. Then she suggested that he go outside so that she could take a picture of him there. Uriela watched in silence. She did not like all this, of course, because there were more dangers that could follow her sister outside. Soon, however, the jellyfish did take the boy, and they went outside. He stood in a very interesting pose, and she immediately started taking pictures of him, because it looked quite cute. Medusa smiled and said that he was incredibly handsome, and also clever because he made such an interesting pose for the photo. At this time, the girl thought that this was just great, because she had just taken flowers to piss off people who annoyed her. And it was a very good thing that she could now use them as a photo area for little Percy. And even though stealing was forbidden by law, the jellyfish didn't care at all. The boy went to one of the large flowers and scrutinized it. Medusa said that these flowers were really incredibly beautiful and asked if he liked them. The girl also explained that they are from the Hesperides, and they are just adorable. They always do well. In fact, most of the local flowers were created because of the anger and whims of the gods, and the jellyfish are so happy about it. After all, if it weren't for their ardor, they wouldn't have such a beautiful landscape. At this time, the girl wondered if this was too nerdy an explanation for the little boy. But he still continued to gaze at the flower, not listening to his mother at all. Then Percy opened his mouth to taste the beautiful flower. The jellyfish reacted in time and said that it was not to be eaten, for flowers are not eaten. They are just held in the hand and perhaps even smelled. The boy stared at this beautiful rose for a while, then shifted his gaze to his mother and made some noises to let her know that she should take a picture of it. Medusa quickly picked up her phone and wondered if he wanted to support her. She had already taken a few pictures because he looked really cute with that flower. When Percy reached for the phone, she immediately held it higher so he couldn't reach it, and said that it was definitely not allowed, because the camera was quite expensive, and he might accidentally drop it and break it. This made Percy very angry, and he was ready to cry. Then the girl asked him why he wanted to take the camera, because it might even be dangerous for him. When the jellyfish saw his angry look, she asked him to stop looking at her like that, because it was no excuse at all. And the camera is cruel and heavy, so he might even get hurt because of his carelessness. They went a little further, for the jellyfish wanted to distract him somehow. But it was no use. The boy really wanted to hold the camera in his hands. She said that he was getting stubborn like a bull again, and that made her a little angry. Percy insisted on his own way, however, and wanted to take the camera from her hands. The girl tried to explain to him why on earth he could not be all pants, and then also said that when they came home, she would tell him everything. Why she could even be dangerous for him. When they reached the house, the girl put her hand up and wanted to say the first reason why he shouldn't use the camera. But at that moment, an eagle flew past them and grabbed her arm. Percy, astonished, began to stare at this unknown animal, which he had never seen before in his life, and he could not even utter a single sound, for she interested him so much. In fact, this eagle was a griffin. It had the body of a lion and the head of an eagle, and also loved shiny things. And despite its rather small size, it's incredibly strong. So he easily lifted the jellyfish up. The girl flew straight after him and thought it looked quite funny. But when the griffin began to rise higher and higher, she screamed loudly, asking him to lower her to the ground. She started calling him some kind of fake magpie, asking what he was even up to, and why he was taking her somewhere she didn't understand. Medusa also looked him straight in the face and said that it was incredibly hard on him, and he was even turning blue, so she told him to let her go already. Uriela, who had now decided to follow her sister everywhere, looked out from behind a tree when she heard some strange noise. She looked up and saw that she was being carried away by a huge griffin. When she saw it, she was shocked. She didn't understand what her sister was even doing. How could she fight a griffin with a camera in her hands? The animal, in turn, even started pecking her snakes on the head in protest. In fact, some species of eagles feed on snakes. Therefore, it was even very tasty. Medusa continued to scream, asking him to leave her hair alone already, and asked what he was even doing, not sure why he was doing it. Uriela was still puzzled. She didn't understand why the girl was fighting, but she assumed it was because of the baby. Then she turned her gaze to Percy, who was just beginning to walk away in the other direction. She turned to the little boy in surprise, asking him where he was going, and the boy, in turn, began to approach the jellyfish, which continued to struggle with the eagle. Medusa, when she turned in his direction and saw him approaching, she immediately panicked, for it was too dangerous in this place. But the boy was not going to listen to her. He approached the eagle with an absolutely confident look and step, and then he began to shout at it with some incomprehensible sounds and words. This animal was madly frightened and immediately threw the phone and the girl and flew away, also making some ferocious sounds in response. Medusa was silent for a while. Then he turned to Percy in surprise and asked if he had managed to drive him away, and said it was incredible. But then she remembered that he was just a kid after all, and said it was incredibly dangerous, because griffins are predators, so you shouldn't lash out at them and hit them and scold them. So there you go. The boy listened to her attentively for a while. After that, he just hugged the girl. When the jellyfish felt his small hands on her body, she didn't expect him to understand. She felt incredibly pleased that the boy had shown his love in this way. She looked at him with a concerned look and wondered if he had really done it to save her. The boy didn't answer anything. He only blushed more and just stared at the girl. Medusa, in turn, said that she was incredibly touched and did not understand how a child as small as him could do such a thing. Medusa couldn't contain her emotions any longer, so she started kissing her in gratitude and love. Her sister stood behind her and watched with a very strange expression on her face. Uriela, who had been observing this whole situation all this time, thought about the fact that the child certainly seems good. However, she was quite sure that he was the reason for all of this. Medusa in turn continued to hug the baby, who saw her sister and stared intently straight into her eyes. The girl thought that surely now it was possible to laugh at this accidental incident, which fortunately ended well. But the fact was that the jellyfish was in danger again and could have been seriously injured. Uriela also thought about the fact that these were the kind of ridiculous accidents that would happen more and more every day, and it wasn't a given that she would be able to avoid them. The girl was well aware that this child, who now seemed completely innocent, was actually incredibly dangerous. After all that had happened, they returned home quite early, and Jellyfish put Percy to bed in order that he might gain strength. Her sister at that moment thought that she had to do something. So in the middle of the night, she came up to him with a candle and pointed her finger to her lips so that he would realize that he had to keep quiet. Then in a whisper, the girl said they had to go. Percy peeked out of the crib and stared at her in surprise, not understanding what she wanted. The moment Uriela looked into those innocent little eyes, she even felt a little sorry for the little guy. She knew, however, that he would only bring trouble. So in a whisper she asked that he go along with his aunt, since they had somewhere to go. The boy just looked at her anyway. Then she decided to take special measures and took him in her arms. While passing by the room of the jellyfish who was sleeping peacefully, one of the snakes suddenly sensed something wrong. Uriela and the child walked into the depths of the dark forest quickly enough. The boy sat in her arms and studied the trees they passed. The girl, turning to Percy, said that the jellyfish was quite different from herself and their older sister, and this child was doomed to die from birth. The snakehead monster would be damaged by the hero's chop, and so she and her sister took refuge in a place far from humans in order to precisely and protect the jellyfish. And they walked farther and farther through the dark forest, and Uriela, lighting the way, said that eventually, arbitrarily, she began to pick up an orphan without a home and look after him. Medusa is a most unusual creature, but far kinder than any living being. Percy, though still a little boy, listened attentively to everything his aunt told him. Soon they came to the place where she had led them. The boy looked around and suddenly saw the ocean shore. Where the waves were raging, and he could hardly see anything, for it was night. Then this snake, which had been dining on the jellyfish's head, sensed even more wrong. It suddenly hissed and tried to wake up its mistress. But all was useless. For a jellyfish, if it falls asleep, it is for a long time. Then the snake had to take emergency measures, so it quickly bit her on the cheek. The girl, when she felt intense pain, immediately woke up asking, "What happened?" She started swearing when she saw that it was her snakes, asking why she suddenly revolted. The girl also shouted and asked, "Did he really decide to have a salt riot? And she was sleeping so sweetly, wasn't she?" But the snake in turn waved its head. She tried to explain the whole situation, but it was hard enough for the jellyfish to understand, for they did not speak. At this very time, Uriela had already seated Percy in a small box that was on the boat, and inquired if he had ever sailed on such things. But then, she laughed suddenly, remembering that he was still very tiny. She said Percy needn't worry, for she wouldn't throw him away like those unscrupulous people. She took the oars in her hands and said that it was just about time for him to get out of here, so she pushed the boat with her oar, in order to swim with him not far away. The girl told the baby, who was sitting in a box and watching intently, that she would send him back to where he came from. She was going to cross the river into the human world. And when he returned, no one would think him an annoying child, for he would be a stranger among strangers. And from then on, the jellyfish will live safely too. So everyone's in an advantageous position. Percy looked at his aunt in surprise and said the jellyfish's name. Percy looked at his aunt in surprise and said the name of the jellyfish. They continued to swim farther and farther away, but the boy suddenly looked down and began to say something. The girl didn't understand anything and asked him to repeat it. Then Percy began to say 2 words. Bulbul. The girl looked down and thought he meant bubbles, and said that it must be the first time he had ever seen even the sea. But she also warned him not to even dare to jump, because the sea was too big, and she would not be able to save him if he drowned. And he certainly can't swim because he is still very young. Percy continued to stare out at the ocean, repeating the same thing over and over. Uriela tried to ignore his childish babbling. She was more interested in why their boat was not floating, no matter how hard she tried, but was standing still. The girl looked down, thinking that surely the current must be going the other way. But then with a thumbs up, she realized that the wind was definitely blowing in their direction, so that was impossible. Uriela looked around and sighed heavily, saying that it was all rather strange. Percy, for his part, continued to sit in the box, looking out at the ocean that was passing them by. At this point, Jellyfish had already realized everything. She ran into her older sister's room, asking her to wake up. Sphina, turning on her other side, replied in a husky voice that she wasn't asleep actually. Then the jellyfish with difficulty lifted her from the bed, saying that they had had a misfortune, for Persia was gone, and their sister was gone too. No one was absolutely gone. The 2 of them had run away. Sphina looked at her in surprise and asked her to calm down and speak a little slower to understand, but the jellyfish screamed even more, asking how she could calm down. Then the sister understood after all, and they packed up and went outside. And as soon as the girls crossed the threshold of their house, they immediately saw large footprints that went somewhere in the forest. Uriela was still struggling with this boat, in order to finally get away. She decided to check the direction, but it seemed to be right. Percy, on the other hand, was pulling himself as close to the water as he could, and kept saying something inaudible. The girl was incredibly annoyed by this, so she shouted at him, telling him to shut up already. She sighed heavily, thinking that it was probably all for nothing, because he was too hard to deport. Actually, Uriela didn't have the best temperament, and what was particularly horrible was her trait there that she was very quick to drop things halfway through when she especially wasn't getting anywhere. Percy at this point started to say something even louder. Then the girl turned around and starts yelling at him, and said that she didn't understand how much noise he could make. She was about to send him home, and he was preventing her from coming up with a plan to make it happen. The boy in turn began to point somewhere in the direction of the ocean, and again to say something incomprehensible. Uriela shouted at him and asked him what he was saying all the time, for she did not understand a word. She moved closer to him, telling him that everything was calm, but for some reason, he was yelling. The boy kept saying something inaudible and kept pointing to the bottom of the ocean. He was getting annoyed that she couldn't figure out what he was pointing at. Uriela suddenly, when she saw his little fingers pointing down somewhere, immediately decided to check it out. She dipped her paddle to the bottom and was very surprised at what she felt. Percy, for his part, was quite watching it happen, for he was the first to notice something amiss. In fact, the Hesperides were walking by the shore at the same time. My sister sighed happily and said that nighttime walks were incredibly good, and sometimes it was wonderful to wander alone and in complete silence. Hesperides II, smiling, said that everything was fine except for the fact that they were after the night shift. But the other one, smiling, said to make it through the whole now plant season, and it's quite normal for them to have such a workload. In fact, the Hesperides are nymphs who are obliged to guard the garden to the end of their days, in order to ensure that nothing bad happens there and no plant withers there. But at that moment, one of the girls suddenly turned around and said that there was something strange by the river. The girls took a closer look and thought it looked like jellyfish sisters. Then the other sister said they looked more formidable than usual. You see, the girls were indeed running incredibly fast toward the shore. Medusa, in turn, shouted loudly, saying that it was a sister. If she repeats such an incident again, it will definitely go into the coffin. The older sister didn't argue, and said that it was definitely. She didn't know what Uriela was thinking. You can't take children outside in the middle of the night. They have to sleep. When she turned to her older sister and asked what she was doing while their middle sister was doing something so stupid. But Sphina didn't say anything to that. She said she didn't really know she'd come up with such a crazy plan. Medusa, for her part, was even angrier, not knowing how such a thing was possible. She also said that she was fed up with them all, that she couldn't live with her sister anymore, because she mumbled nonsense to herself all day long, and now she had decided that Percy could be taken away without permission. Medusa continued to scream, saying that after this she couldn't live with this sister anymore. Sphina, for her part, just ran and listened to all this. She decided not to get involved, because she could only make things worse. At this very time, Uriela had already taken out her paddle from the sea, but nothing happened for a while, as suddenly a huge wave rose straight up into the sky. The girl was very frightened because of this. She was quick to react, and so she took little Percy into her arms, who might have been hurt because of it. At that moment, a huge creature began to appear under the water. It was a large head, as if it were some kind of snake, and when the girl looked at it, she could not help but be horrified. Uriela couldn't believe that one of the monsters of this ocean wasn't hibernating right now. So she set Percy on the ground and asked if she could move away, for she and her mistress had gone to the same art school. Still with that, she just smiled. And then it started to move straight at the girl and the baby and show its huge and bloodthirsty teeth. The girl immediately realized that this was certainly not going to end in a good thing, so she didn't even know what to do. At that moment, the monster landed right next to the sonar, and the girl screamed with fear and surprise. Uriela couldn't believe that this miracle of humanity didn't understand. After all, just a little more, and they would be a fish appetizer right now. Percy was really frightened too, so he moved closer to the girl and began to hug her. When she looked down and saw that he was really scared too, she realized that she had to comfort him somehow. She took him in her arms and put her arm around Percy, telling him to hold on as tightly as she could. Because of the strong impact, their boat cracked, and they were beginning to sink. The girl was scared and didn't know what to do now. She had never been in such situations before. But then suddenly they heard another loud sound. It was that monster again, landing even closer, to break their boat completely. Uriela moved back a little and said that he was apparently trying to eat them all together, and didn't know what she should do now. The monster itself at this moment began to eat this wood that made up the boat with gusto. It was taking a bite before eating the main course, which was this girl and the baby. At that moment, Uriela heard someone's familiar voice behind her. It was Jellyfish, addressing her sister. Medusa ran gal closer and closer to them and asked what she was even doing there, and why she needed a cub, and where the eel was from. Uriela was incredibly happy to see her sisters when she turned in their direction. She was about to ask how they had found them, but the monster at that moment grabbed her by her clothes and began to lift her up. Percy, when he saw this, immediately became worried and wanted to help her somehow. At that moment, the voice of the jellyfish was heard, addressing her sister. She asked to be patient. They were about to turn this monster into a statue. In fact, the jellyfish could turn any living creatures into a statue, but only needed to meet their gaze. But now it was very difficult to do that. The fish had eyes like peas, and he couldn't even see where he was looking. So the older sister suggested that the first thing to do was to throw the rope and rescue Percy first. After that, they would think about what to do with their sister. So they threw the rope to the boy, who was already in the water. Medusa shouted, turning to him and telling him to hold on as tight as he could, and they would help him now, and he would be safe. The boy, in turn, looked at his aunt, who had already been eaten by the monster. He suddenly felt sorry, so he let go of the rope and disobeyed the jellyfish. The girls, when they saw this, were very surprised. They didn't understand what he was doing, and most importantly, why he was doing it. because he was still very young. Percy, for his part, somehow managed to swim as close as he could through the waves, and then he jumped so high that he hit the monster right in its huge head. All the gargoyle sisters, when they saw this, they immediately screamed loudly, very worried about the boy. But everything went very well because of the fact that the monster did not expect such a strong blow. It immediately let Uriela go, and the two of them, along with the baby, began to fall. The jellyfish reacted in time to prevent Percy from touching the water with the tip of her body. When she caught the boy, she immediately hugged him, asking him if he was hurt. In fact, she was incredibly frightened that something terrible might have happened to him. Then she asked how he had even gathered such courage to hit that huge fish. At that moment, that monster hid in the water, for indeed it was incredibly painful and unpleasant for him to lose to the little boy. Medusa remembered that she still had a sister who might have been badly hurt. She turned to her and asked if she was all right. Uriela felt a little uneasy, so she was about to explain everything to her. But then suddenly they were interrupted by Percy's voice, who called her Aunt and Medusa by name. The girls, when they heard this, immediately began to smile. And so Jellyfish proposed to postpone this conversation to another time and talk at home, discussing all the details. So when they got home, Uriela had to explain everything. She sat down on the table across from her younger sister and said that it was her own decision to take Percy. Even for the sake of the jellyfish, she shouldn't have really taken such big risks. So she apologized to the two of them, saying that she was really to blame for this. Medusa folded her arms across her chest and said that it was no big deal. She would forgive her that way. After all, everything was fine in Sparcy, and everything had worked out. Uriela, when she heard that she was indeed forgiven, was very surprised. Medusa didn't even understand why she was reacting so violently, because it was only natural, since they were sisters. But the jellyfish actually looked at Percy and said that it was hard for her to turn a blind eye to her sister's act so easily, for it was incredibly dangerous not only to her own life, but also to the life of this little one who had experienced incredible stresses over the past time. Well, after all, she will keep it, for she liked Percy, so she has no right to deprive him of the people he loves. Uriela looked at the boy in surprise, and then shifted her gaze to her sister, asking why she even thought she liked him. Medusa explained that he had called her auntie, and she had taught him that, but it was a mystery how he could even remember it since he was still very young. The girl was incredibly pleased to hear all this, and she was even a little embarrassed about what had happened. Then the elder sister spoke up, saying that she was glad that they had finally made up. Even though Uriela's actions were really rash and excessive, she was still truly worried about Jellyfish. Sphina put her head down and said that they too apologized for not looking out for the two of them and hoped that in the future they would discuss with each other and make difficult decisions together. The girls felt a little uncomfortable, because of course they couldn't promise that, because they were always arguing about something. But then suddenly the silence was interrupted by Percy, who turned to the two of them and asked them to make up. Medusa looked at the boy and wondered how on earth he could have learned another word, but he in turn kept talking about truce. Then the girl, thinking, said that she had met quite a few children, but this was the first time she had seen such a savvy one, so she assumed that he was probably some kind of genius. Uriela entered the conversation and said that it would be obvious, for this child was destined to be a hero. At that moment, there was a knock at their house. Jellyfish went to open the door, and her sister at that moment began to tell the boy that she was a fool for learning it. Medusa opened a small slit and saw the sisters of the Hesperides, who waved happily to her, saying hello. The girl, of course, was not very happy to see them at this late hour, and decided to just close the door. And when the eldest of the sisters saw this, she began to yell at her, asking why she was being so inhospitable, because they were worried about them, and she was treating them like this. The girls began to squeeze through the gap, saying that they had seen them on their way home at night, on their way to go somewhere in a hurry. So they thought something had happened to the baby, so they decided to visit them right away. Medusa said she was certainly grateful for their concern, but pointing to the older Hesperid, asked what she was even doing here. Well, the girls couldn't say anything more because Percy suddenly ran up to her and started calling the jellyfish a fool and repeated it time after time. When those present heard this, Everyone immediately laughed, for it was really very funny and ridiculous. Everyone liked the way he did it, except of course for the jellyfish himself, who was being called names. The younger Hesperides came closer to the boy and said that it was quite amazing because he was developing so fast, and if things continued at this pace, he would soon be able to read books on his own. Medusa went up to her sister and her worst enemy and slapped them so hard against each other and said that yes, he really is a smarty-pants, and she thought he was just imitating adults, because now he was at an age where everything was interesting. When his older sister looked at Percy and said that his rate of development and assimilation was really first-rate, and she thought it was possible to teach him the simplest phrases already, Medusa immediately ran up to him and told him that children should only be taught good things, so she started asking him to say the word, "thank you." The boy looked at her in surprise for a while, and then tried to repeat the word several times, but he couldn't do anything, and it was more like some involuntary sounds and sobs. When the Hesperides heard this, they immediately started laughing out loud because it was really very ridiculous. Then the older sister looked at them menacingly and said in a cold voice that apparently long words were not yet his forte, and he could only memorize short ones for the time being. Medusa thought for a moment, and then said that meant he should say words of 2 or 3 syllables to him. Then the younger Hesperides suggested that in such a case, he should learn the names of animals and plants. She had just taken some books with her so that she could show him examples clearly. At this point, she started pulling out many different books on how to be a hero, a children's dictionary, and many more different. Uriela, taking one of them in her hands, began leafing through it, and said that it was such a nostalgia for her, for she used to love to read such books. Hesperides, smiling, said that she really did too. Medusa in turn held one out to the boy, asking if he thought it was unusual. She gave him the book in her hand, saying that it was a book, and if you think about it that way, she had never given them to anyone before. Hesperides, the eldest, came closer and said that it was all wonderful. However, one wonders how someone like Jellyfish could have such a sweet and intelligent child. The girl looked at her angrily and asked her if she was prying. The girl looked at her angrily and asked her if she was being pushy. The older sister came up to them and separated the girls, saying that they really didn't have a book in the house that Percy could afford, which means they need more interesting things for the baby, because the ones that Uriela had only brought terror and fear. The elder sister looked at them and said that thanks to them they had learned something very important, so she expressed her sincere gratitude to the Hesperides. The girl was a little surprised by this and smiled and said that it was nothing special, but she was still glad they were useful to them. When Jellyfish thoughtfully suggested that in that case they should go for a walk and get a few things for the baby, since they were keeping him anyway, they'd have to figure something out. Sphina smiled and said it was very good, for they would be able to walk to the market as a family for the first time in a long time. Medusa was happy about it herself, but their other sister looked at the older one and asked if it was necessary to do that, since he was contentedly interested, and the book she read to him all the time. And when Jellyfish saw the cover, she asked if there was any censorship. Her older sister agreed, saying that no matter how smart a kid is, he's still a kid, and he needs toys that are age-appropriate. They are determined to raise this child properly, so responsibility won't do here, and it has to be done at least for the sake of the jellyfish. Uriela glimpsed the little one, who was sitting at the book and kept repeating the words he read there. Hesperides came to him and told him that this book would be very difficult for him, so she wanted to offer him an easier one. At this point the boy began to read that the Trojans ran into the city, like frightened men. The Lani underdrained and drank and quenched their thirst, and along the wall without leaning against the battlements the Achaeans were approaching. They moved right up against the wall, shields bent over their shoulders. Everyone present when they heard this was very surprised, for it was one of the heaviest books available, and not even every adult could afford it. Uriela then continued to insist on her own while Jellyfish went to cheer for Persia, and asked her sister if he definitely needed to buy something new. Sphina said of course it was necessary, for no matter how well he read the poems, a child is still a child. Medusa lifted Percy's perch. She said, "All right, I've only got him to read for now, so no need to push the kid." But now it dawned on her, they should raise him well. Then it would be a genius, a billionaire, and many more good qualities in him. Her sister looked at her in surprise and asked if they were really pushing the baby now, because in her opinion, it was the jellyfish that was doing it. When Hesperides came up to them and asked what about their other books, the jellyfish said she could give them up and leave. Already her sister was indignant and asked what kind of rude behavior this was and wondered about her sister if she was sorry. Hesperides Jr. laughed and said that she had read them all, so there was nothing wrong with that. The girl had to agree after all, and she said they still had a lot to do, so they would go and also wish them luck with the baby. But suddenly the older sister, the gargoyle, suggested that they stay for dinner. The girls were a little frightened and said they didn't have to. They really had to go. Medusa agreed with them and turned to her sister and asked why they should be fed at all, so they had better leave already. Hesperides waved goodbye and really started to leave towards the exit. Sphena said that there was no problem if they did stay over for dinner, but the jellyfish decided to change the subject and said it would be better to decide now what Percy needed to buy. The girls had to agree after all. Then Jellyfish looked at her other sister and asked if she would go with them. Uriela, who was initially against the idea, hesitated for a while, but the moment she looked at the pitiful look on the boy's face, whose eyes were shining straight up, she had to agree after all. And you, therefore, sisters of the Gorgon, realizing the full talent of this child destined to be a genius, went to the marketplace. And so, from that moment on, a few hours passed. They decided to leave Percy at home, so that he wouldn't cause them too much trouble at the market. So when they came back, having bought a lot of different toys, they started to put him to bed. Medusa hummed a lullaby to the boy, but he just sat staring at her angrily, not wanting to fall asleep. Medusa asked him not to be so angry, but to go to bed already. After all, when he woke up, she would already be home, and they would be back very soon. The girls had something else to go to, and then she closed the door, but not all the way, so that she could run in quickly in case of emergency. The boy pretended to go to bed, but as soon as Percy heard the footsteps fall silent, he immediately jumped out of the crib and climbed down, jumping to the ground and landing like a superhero straight up. After that, he got closer to the exit, then got to his feet and started to walk away. He began to whistle, a sign of his triumph, but in fact Percy was early to rejoice. For although he is indeed a hero, he is still a child, so the door will be very difficult for him to open. Then Percy began to try, but he couldn't succeed. And then some time passed, and he finally figured out how to open it. When he opened the door a little, he looked around and saw that no one was home. He went out the door and saw a lot of beautiful things. Such a thrilling sight it was to the child, and even the weight of fate did not weigh him down. Life at this moment, Percy saw a whole bunch of apples near him, and when he reached them, he went straight to the pile. He lay enjoying his favorite product for a while and then decided to look at something else nearby. With very great difficulty, but the boy still managed to jump up to the nightstand. There was a huge family photo of a jellyfish. Percy stopped in front of her and began to stare. The jellyfish actually had a very large family, and he wasn't the monster's only child. But soon Percy got bored of looking at these portraits, so he quickly jumped away, throwing some papers that were on the nightstand down. Because he was alone at home, the boy could do absolutely anything he wanted, because no one would scold or judge him. So his soul went on a rampage, and he started throwing absolutely everything around, enjoying what he could do. Percy then ran out into the street, in which he felt himself a perfectly free man, and very glad of the flowers he could touch and the ground on which to lie. And now a long time has passed, and Jellyfish and her sisters have finally already returned home with many different purchases. As soon as she entered the apartment, she said she had bought him lots of goodies and various toys for him. But then suddenly seeing the mess, she screamed loudly in surprise. The girl clutched her head, not understanding why their house was such a mess, and her expensive flowers that she had bought at the auction were scattered all over the house, and there was probably no way to recover them. Jellyfish looked around then, wondering what had even happened and where Percy was. She even considered the possibility that a thief had broken in. But at that moment her older sister picked up one of the apples that was lying on the floor and told her to look at it. The girl ran at once to the bedroom where she put little Percy to bed. In fact, the boy was just lying down and sleeping peacefully among all his toys. for he was very tired while everyone was away. Medusa picked him up in her arms and hugged him, saying that it was very good that he was safe, because the house was such a mess, and she was very scared because of it. She also said that a thief must have gotten into the house somehow, and she was glad that nothing had happened to him. Uriela was holding an apple and thinking that it was obvious that Percy had done it all. He just got out of bed and made such a mess of the house. But suddenly, her sister came to her and said that they would not change her mind because nothing irreparable had happened. Uriela sighed heavily, and I said that they would miss that too. Medusa, for her part, continued to kiss the baby, for she was very worried indeed. Sphina, upon reflection, said that perhaps it was just about time to do some renovations to the house so that the baby could move around safely. Of course, my sister didn't like it, but after a while of silence, she said in a quiet voice that it felt like she had a real family now. Her older sister said, with a hug and a smile, that it was actually true. Uriela rolled her eyes and said she was sick of the sentimentality, but she couldn't help it. When they came out of the baby's bedroom, they looked around and saw really the greatest mess, and didn't know where to even start in order to clean it all up. Quite a bit of time had passed since then, and now, one sunny afternoon, the young hero was just plain mad, and no one knew how to stop him. Uriela asked her sister to quiet him at last, for the boy was running from side to side, but the jellyfish replied that she would not do so. After all, he doesn't cry and he doesn't make noise, so she should just ignore him. However, the sister became indignant and said it had been going on for an hour. He told her, "At this rate, he's going to put her in a coffin, and she can't even practice her fortune-telling." Medusa brewed herself some fresh coffee and told herself it was just a childish tantrum, so she should just relax and ignore it all. She sat down in the yoga pose where she usually catches her calm, and said it was all a problem in her thinking. Medusa, surprisingly, was incredibly calm that day. Uriela, in turn, when she looked at her, got even more angry, for she had apparently caught her zen, and the girl can't even focus on her favorite thing. Medusa explained that it's not really that the boy has nothing to do, it's that he just gets bored of everything too quickly. She smiled and said that the cub was incredibly smart. Then his older sister intervened, saying that he was a really fast learner, so the stuff they bought him was boring Percy. New books and toys bore him quickly because he is very advanced and can quickly browse through it all and get lost. So he suffers endlessly from boredom and lack of new information for his brain. Medusa, sighing heavily, said that no matter what they do to him, he's always frustrated and bored. Being smart is certainly a good thing, but apparently it's more like a curse. My older sister, being the wisest, said that everything has its pros and cons, so it's not surprising. Percy kept rolling around on the floor, not knowing what to do, and Jellyfish said she couldn't even think of anything. Sphina, after some thought, asked if the child might be too crowded in the small house to go out with him. When Percy heard this, he jumped to his feet and ran up to his sisters. Medusa said she'd love to do it, but she can't yet. She had ordered a special amulet to avoid death, and it would not be delivered until tomorrow. Uriela, when she heard about this amulet, she immediately realized that it was their biological sister Gray who came up with such a thing. But then Sphina said, "Since they can't go for a walk, what about playing a game of some sort?" When Percy heard about it, he was immediately enthusiastic, and the girl suggested that they all play poker. Of course, no one was against it, so they sat down at a huge round table and dealt each other cards for the number they needed. Everyone was incredibly focused. When the game began, the jellyfish suddenly became anxious and asked, "Does Percy even understand the rules of the game, since she hasn't explained them to him?" However, Uriela, after seeing him beat her card, said that in her opinion he was doing fine. The boy was indeed very focused on the game, and they decided to give it a try after all. Some time had passed since then, and the older sister, when she got rid of her cards, said that she was done, and because of that, she took first place. So the boys decided to play a few more games. And now, hours later, they were still playing. Percy's eyes were shining with joy. It was obvious that they had finally found something he liked to do. But Jellyfish, along with her sisters, were already incredibly tired, and she asked if they could stop for the day. The boy frowned and began to mumble something. She, because she was very tired, couldn't think of anything and kept losing, and she said that they could play another game, because he was satisfied after all. Uriela, when she saw all of this, thoughtfully said that they would need several options, since they couldn't play just one poker game all the time. Medusa, collapsing on the table from fatigue, said that she did not know, for she knew very little about games at all. Then the sister replied that she knew another game, so she would teach them all. When Jellyfish heard this, she immediately became excited and asked how it was that her shy introvert sister knew games to play with other people. Uriela frowned, but decided not to respond and told them to wait a bit, because she had to bring all the paraphernalia for this. But then the older sister got up from the table and said that she would skip the game because she still had to cook, and they could have fun. Soon, the girl brought the necessary paraphernalia and said that the three of us wouldn't be as much fun. However, she pulled out a special kind of deck of playing cards to get things started. When Jellyfish saw it, she immediately became alarmed. She realized what the cards were, so she got angry at her sister and asked her what she was teaching the child. But Uriela said that in her opinion, Percy was very much in favor of playing it. The girl objected and said that he didn't even understand it, so she'd better suggest something else, like Uno or Monopoly. But the sister smiled and said that she was outright insulting her. If she thinks these playing cards are inappropriate, then the only problem is her thinking. Percy really didn't mind trying to play some new game, and she said he was even intrigued. The girl added, however, that she was not a croupier, so she could not teach him much, only the basics that she knew herself. Medusa sighed heavily and said that they must have found common ground, and asked if she could look after him. She was very tired, so she needed sleep, since she couldn't even stand on her feet. Uriela said she was sorry, but after that the girl left. She was going to sleep, but she can't stop worrying about this horrible card game. Her sister was too stupid to raise a small child. Even though she'd asked her to watch the baby to sleep, she felt that maybe she should have stayed there and watched them properly. But at that moment the jellyfish covered her eyes only for a second, for they were beginning to hurt her very much, and immediately fell asleep. It had been quite some time since then, and she finally opened her eyes. Then she realized that she had fallen asleep while she was thinking about how irresponsible her sister was. The girl immediately started to get out of bed and decided to go check on her sister and Percy. But as soon as the jellyfish entered the room, she was in for a big surprise. Percy was already sitting with a deck of cards and was stirring them very well. Uriela, seeing her sister, said that this boy was a real genius, and that he had learned everything very quickly. Medusa tried to hold back her angry emotions. She approached the boy and told him that what his aunt had taught him could not be applied to his life, and asked him if he understood what she had just told him. Uriela was very indignant at this point, because her sister had turned her to stone again, and there was absolutely nothing she could do. Medusa, in her turn, told the boy that not everyone could play such a game, but Percy listened to her for a while and then said a bad word. He did not, however, fully pronounce it, but it was enough for the girl even if he said a few letters of the word, so she got even more angry at her sister and was ready to kill her. Then the elder sister came to the rescue, and taking the boy, said that it was time for them to eat, for Jellyfish and Uriela had some other things to do. Percy, for his part, went on saying these incomprehensible words, and when his sister heard it, she was wary, saying that Evrial must have taught him something strange. She also said that learning is definitely very beneficial. However, one should not say such things because they are bad. The boy, when he heard this, immediately turned his attention to her, not understanding what she meant. Then Sphina said some very old saying, which Percy still more did not understand. She took him in her arms and told him that the jellyfish amulets had been delivered, so from the next day they would be able to go out for walks together. When Percy heard this, he was glad at once. Then his sister came into the room and suggested that everyone else go and eat together. However, when she entered the room, she saw Jellyfish yelling at her sister's statue, and realized it was best not to interfere in their conflict. Sphina turned to Percy in a whisper and said that they would probably eat this supper together. When the jellyfish saw her sister in the passage, she told her to wait a little longer, for she would finish her business and come up, and they could begin without her. And so the next day when Jellyfish woke up, Da immediately put on the amulet from Gray, saying that it should make up for some of the problems Percy was bringing. and she would be able to have a normal daily life with him. Then she looked at her sister, who was just at that moment keeping an eye on Percy, and asked if it suited her. Uriela, thinking about it, said it was more like mosquito repellent. But the jellyfish replied that she wasn't talking about that at all, but about its properties. His sister immediately said that it wasn't bad at all. There was some kind of magical illusion hidden in the amulet. Medusa was overjoyed and said it was a victory. Now she could go out with Percy without worrying that someone would kill her. But Uriela was wary and said she didn't even know anyone in her neighborhood. So where was she going to go anyway? Medusa smiled and said she was going to get coffee. Percy was alarmed when he heard this, for he had never heard the word before. Hesperides is actually a fairy tale island that has been completely untouched by humans. A land of fairies, dragons, and monsters that has been shrouded in mist. It is a place where legends come to life that no human dares to touch. And there was a cafe on the beach overlooking the entire ocean called Scylla. And that's where Jellyfish and Percy went. It had been quite some time since they had started their journey. But here they finally came to the place where her soul resided, and she had wanted to come here for a long time. Percy stood behind the girl and began to look around carefully, for he had never seen such a thing before. As soon as they came in, Scylla, who was a water nymph, greeted them at once out of habit. But when she saw the jellyfish, she was very much surprised. The girl approached Scylla and said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other, and then asked that she give her what she always gave her as soon as possible. But the girl only looked at her in surprise and asked, "Is she really alive?" She thought she was dead. Medusa asked her what she was talking about. So Scylla decided to turn the conversation and asked, "Who is this human boy? Is it a new one?" The girl replied that that was right. His name was Percy. Then the saleswoman waved her head and said that this child had a very dangerous fate, but it was none of her business. So she asked, "What should I bring this little one?" Medusa said he was still very young, so just milk was needed. However, at that moment they heard his voice, which was quiet at first, saying the word coffee. After that, he started repeating it louder and louder with even more enthusiasm. And when the jellyfish heard that he wanted coffee, she said that the child could not have it, so she offered him milk or some juice. But the boy insisted on his own way, and when Scylla saw this, she said that he was quite stubborn. Percy started to get very cranky and kept talking about wanting coffee. Medusa sighed heavily and said that he was at it again, and the boy started screaming like a siren at the whole cafe. She felt a little uncomfortable and told him to be quiet in the place, as he was disturbing the other visitors who also wanted to enjoy the day. Other customers who were sitting in the cafe immediately started looking at this child, not understanding why he was even screaming like that. Then the jellyfish decided to give him a candy to shut him up. She took him in her arms, apologized to everyone present, and laughing nervously, said she would only take a cup of coffee for herself and leave immediately. The girl became very uncomfortable, because everyone was looking at her and wanted her to stop talking. At that moment someone approached her from behind and wanted to turn to her and apologize. But the jellyfish was so excited that she even screamed out of fright. Then the sea creature came closer to her and said that she seemed worried about them, but she shouldn't be, because all babies cry until they grow up. The other creature said that it was all right, and they could make themselves comfortable and take their time. Crying would not prevent them from resting in any way. When the jellyfish heard this, she was very surprised. Then she looked at the other visitors who agreed with these two and was even more surprised. She was ready to cry from happiness, because in the place where she used to live, no one accepted her and everyone only judged her. And here people did not even get angry because of such a loud crying baby. Percy, for his part, kept asking for coffee. Then the waitress came up to her, asking what she would order for the baby, since he was apparently not interested in anything but that drink. Medusa apologized to her. She said she didn't know what to do about it. Percy was very willful and stubborn, so she asked the girl if she had any coffee or something that a little child like him could drink. Scylla said, thinking about it, that there was no such thing as coffee. Perhaps it could be diluted so that only the smell remained and mixed with something else. But right now she didn't even have any coffee beans. Medusa, sighing heavily, said that this was very uncool, and there was apparently no way she could get out of this situation because Percy kept yelling about wanting coffee. Scylla suddenly thought about it and said she had an idea. She told the girl to sit down and she would do everything now and bring it over. When the jellyfish heard this, she was immediately overjoyed. She went outside, where there were also tables, and took the most beautiful seat. Some time had passed since then, and finally the girl brought her order. She said that the big glass was for the jellyfish, and the small glass was for the baby. When the jellyfish heard this, he looked closer and asked what was the difference between the two glasses. Percy himself began to look closely, not understanding what the difference was. Then the girl said, thoughtfully, that she had made barley tea for the boy. Seeing Jellyfish's surprised face, she said that when roasted properly, barley tea tastes like coffee and little boys like him can drink it. However, she did not know if he would like it. At this point, Percy began to taste the drink, and the jellyfish, satisfied, praised Scylla, saying that she was a genius, the best graduate of the School of Magic and Wizardry, and that it was a well-deserved title. But the boy, when he tasted the drink, immediately spit it all out in his cup because he didn't really like it. Scylla, in turn, turned to the girl and told her that she was working on a new kind of coffee and asked if she wanted to try it. When the jellyfish heard this, she said, excitedly, that of course she wanted to try it. The girl explained that she wanted the jellyfish to do it, because she was the real coffee sommelier. So they went inside the cafe, and the jellyfish, before leaving, addressed Percy, saying that she would be gone for a while, and that he should be quiet. The boy waved back at her, and the jellyfish said that he was an obedient boy after all, so she hoped for him. But the moment they left, Percy turned toward the sea and stared out at it, smiling. He liked that kind of scenery, and he liked the ocean in general. Medusa was at this moment sitting at the bar waiting for a new taste of Scylla's fine coffee. Percy, for his part, continued to sit back in his chair and heard someone address him. It was the girl at the next table, and she said that fate was paying the hero a visit. The stranger smiled and wondered if they could talk, for he must have a very interesting fate, she wondered. Percy, for his part, looked at her in surprise, not realizing who she even was or what she wanted from him. Medusa, at this point, had already had a chance to try the new coffee. She said that it was incredibly delicious and that it was the best in her collection. Scylla, when she heard about it, immediately began to write something down on a piece of paper and said that she would buy more of it. In the meantime, fate was stretching out its hand before Perseus. But the boy moved away from the stranger, for she was a rather unpleasant person to him. When the girl saw this, she smiled in a mysterious voice and said that he was more cautious than she thought, because usually people stay put, but he suddenly started running away. Percy frowned and didn't answer her. Then the woman said it was her fault, so she decided to formally introduce herself to him. The girl rose to her feet and, bowing, said her name was Lois. She is the one who measures the thread. In fact, the girl was the middle one of the three sisters of Moira, the goddesses of fate, and Percy, when he heard this, was a little interested. He didn't even have time to do anything, however, because a jellyfish appeared behind him. She was very angry, and after taking him in her arms, she immediately moved away from this girl. Medusa looked at her intently and asked what the goddess of fate was doing in the land of 1,000 things. Does she talk to other people's children and try to lure them to her? The girl, upon reflection, wondered if it was Pecto, but the girl said it was pretty much the same. However, still no. She started going through a few names and guessed on the 4th time that it was a jellyfish. The girl apologized, saying she had a pretty bad memory. The goddess of fate also said that she had heard of her saying that she hated them, so she must have had a hard time. Medusa was indignant and said that since she herself knew, she'd better leave, but the girl laughed and replied that it was a little insulting because she said hello, and Scylla makes great coffee, so she just couldn't pass by.